Welcome to the first Nex Gen podcast series produced by the LIDC, Ligue internationale du droit de la concurrence, International League of Competition Law. Throughout a series of 7 episodes, our expert guests will explore the intersection of competition law with emerging technologies like cloud computing and artificial intelligence, and will delve into the legal, economic, and policy challenges these innovations pose to competition regulation worldwide. All the views expressed throughout this podcast are the speaker's own and do not represent the views of the LIDC nor any of the companies and organizations with whom the speakers may be affiliated or the clients they represent.
So I'm delighted to welcome you to the final episode in this podcast series on competition in cloud and AI. In this episode, we're going to think about the path ahead. So we've taken a deep dive into the AI stack. We've thought about cloud-specific issues. We've thought about AI-specific issues and ways in which different jurisdictions are approaching these complex questions. And so now I think we're going to consider more of a forward-looking question, which is what is the ideal? What is the best way in which we can regulate cloud and AI in a way that protects competition, but also stimulates innovation, preserves innovation incentives for firms, and we might refer particularly to the EU approach. I guess from my side on this, from the EU perspective, we have already quite a toolkit at our fingertips. While Article 102 TFEU is somehow no longer in fashion and viewed as ineffective in many ways, it's actually, when you read it, it's hugely elegant, it's open-textured, it can capture cloud, it can capture AI concerns, and I would kind of re-emphasize the value of Article 102. Not all 102 issues take a decade. Also, it's a slower mechanism, but I think it's very possible to accommodate a number of the concerns that we've discussed. The DMA, of course, is interesting because it's a text that doesn't obviously contain provisions relating to cloud, doesn't obviously contain provisions relating to AI. We've discussed in a previous podcast the question of can cloud services be designated under the DMA. I answered in the negative. I think that that's something that the French Competition Authority in particular is pushing for enormously. I think that came out of its study earlier this year into AI competition concerns, that it wanted cloud providers to be designated under the DMA. And then we have questions around the Data Act and recalling our earlier conversation. Certainly cloud is captured, but it's captured in a way that is very, very different to the DMA. The DMA is targeting gatekeeper firms, very small subset of firms, whereas the Data Act is seeking to regulate competition, ostensibly competition issues, through horizontal and symmetric regulation. And we've already raised some of the potential problems that brings. And I guess that for me, when I think about best and worst ways of regulating, I guess that the Data Act is it's not all bad, but for me the approach of essentially putting in place a regime of mandatory contract law has got to be an intervention of last resort. So preserving freedom of contract, preserving commercial liberty of firms, is still, if you talk to economists, this is something that yields typically not only fairer fairer terms, but more efficient terms. And so generally in business-to-business transactions, we want to lay off the mandatory contract law approach. We raised in an earlier podcast the introduction of novel theories of harm, ecosystem theories of harm. And I suppose I'd just bring that back up to say, fantastic that, novel theories are being discussed, fantastic that a really rich academic literature is being brought into the real world, so to speak. But the way in which it is introduced has got to be very delicate. It's got to strike a very careful balance, because in the same way as when notions of platforms came from academic literature into legal practice, suddenly everything was labelled a platform, which it isn't. And now everything under the sun is being labelled as an ecosystem or a potential ecosystem related transaction. Again, I would suggest it isn't. And so we've got to be very, very careful there about getting, from the position of the Commission, let's say, about getting wrapped up in another very interesting novel approach that ends up being a freeze frame of a particular moment in time, and doesn't necessarily genuinely capture the kinds of business models that are really in the market, and doesn't necessarily capture the real harms that are potentially occurring in the market, and rather has the very real risk of dampening incentives, of quashing deals that could be very pro-competitive. So if I can maybe hand over to Shruti or to Lauren to share some thoughts as well.
Sure, I'll go. So I think for me, in terms of regulation, particularly when I look at the data stack, which is where I hang out most, I think we've done really well in terms of data protection legislation. I think one of my concerns around that space is how it's been implemented is very much checkbox and tick box systems. And I would like to see more of a human-centric approach and a harms-based approach to that protection of data. Why are we protecting the data? Because what we've seen more of recently, which I'm delighted about, is, the value of data is actually also something we need to talk about and regulate. And AI really throws that in your face and says data is valuable, and who's got the data and who doesn't have the data is an important question. But when we're dealing with that as well, I really do think to encourage innovation, governments need to think about how they're legislating around data access and data use. So we've got the UK bills just come out around data access and use. We've got the Data Act. And my question very much around those mechanisms, which also include, open banking, are around how is this changing behaviour around data? What is this incentivising companies that have data to do? Is it incentivising them to clean up their data, understand their data and extract the value? Or is it incentivising them to put it in the too hard basket or give it to tech companies who know better? So that would be my suggested approach is think about it data, in fact, tech agnostic and human-centred. How are we using the data and what value and what protections do we need?
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah. From my perspective, I'd echo, I think, a lot of your sentiments, Ben, which is I think we have a lot of existing tools and we need to think carefully before introducing new tools, or we just simply risk over-regulation and regulatory fragmentation, which is an even bigger risk in a sector that is evolving so quickly that legislation will never really keep up with that pace. So I think we've discussed in earlier episodes the possibility of reducing incentives through legislation. Like the Data Act, we discussed that in quite detail. So I think those are I think we really need to be legislators need to be carefully think before introducing further new tools. I mean, there's already, since we're talking about the EU, there's already a pretty complex web of regulations. So just to touch upon like some of what we've been discussing in the last few episodes, you have something like the DMA, which is an EU-level legislation. You then have national law that implements the DMA, so something like the French SREN law. You then have national legislation not related to the DMA. That gives national competition authorities more power over companies in the digital sector. So think here, Section 19A in Germany, Article 19A in Germany. You then have EU-wide regulation like the Data Act, which covers some similar ground to some of the other legislations like the DMA, say, for example, in relation to interoperability. But then there are certain nuances and areas where they differ. And then finally, you also have existing competition law. So, you're already in the EU dealing with this really complex web of regulations. And then there's, other regulations not related to competition that I'm not even talking about here.
Absolutely.
So there's already a very complex web. And I think the need of the hour is really an internationally coordinated, sort of cohesive approach, because otherwise I think what could end up happening, I mean, the impact on companies goes without saying, but I think in terms of the outcome for consumers, what could end up happening is that the regulatory fragmentation could mean that some jurisdictions could benefit from being more sort of flexible in their legislation. Yes. Or you could have the other outcome, which is that companies that operate globally, which is a lot of companies in the space, because it doesn't really have borders. Companies that operate globally, in order to be compliant, would sort of adopt their compliance standard to be the one that is the strictest. And then, therefore, actually everyone around the world would actually end up getting less innovative products and services in the end. So I think there's a real risk here to consumer outcomes as well that needs to be thought about.
I think that's fascinating, and this reminds me very much of the discussion around the GDPR, and there's some very interesting academic literature. So there's a colleague of ours at the Centre for Competition Policy, Michael Kummer, has a paper with Joel Waldvogel and others, which looks at the impact of the GDPR on apps in the Play Store. And it's so interesting because, of course, so I'm not here making a value judgment about whether the GDPR is good, whether it's effective. I'm not making that comment. But what is interesting is that we see companies responding to that complex piece of regulation, sometimes by exiting the market. And we saw a big exodus of apps. Now, on the one hand, that's a cleansing, some would say, of the things we didn't want. But then we look at the entry side, and we also see an impact on entry, and that's very interesting and problematic. I think when we broaden it out. So maybe in a GDPR context, that was what was intended by the regulator. Maybe it was for the better. But if we think about cloud and the discussion we've just had around feature complexity, around diminished incentives for firms to introduce new features if they have to comply with equivalence or functional equivalence, that strikes me as a very negative potential impact. If those firms decide to say, no, we won't introduce certain features in the EU, So for me, we actually already have some lessons. There's some great economic papers out there, legal papers out there that are going through the data on impact of regulation. And so I think that I'd echo what Shruti said there, which is that we're going to be very, very mindful of potential unintended consequences. Yeah. And if I may abuse my position as chair to make one final point, which is that, I was rereading James Besson's latest book and thinking to myself that he makes a really important observation, which is just a very broad observation that applies to this whole podcast series, which is that, so if we take the cloud, cloud is a sector that was born basically because a private company, Amazon, decided to open up, license, of course, make money out of it, but open up a proprietary IT system. And that is exactly what we want, says Besson, in the economy. We want to incentivize precisely that behavior, because what does it do? It broadens the pie. So Amazon, clearly made a decision, as other firms that have licensed out patents in the past. If we think about the car industry, we have examples of that. Examples abound, in fact, where if the incentives are right, firms are able to say, okay, we have a particular size slice of a massively expanding pie. That's great for everybody. And I guess that my concluding kind of thought as to what's the dream regulatory environment, what does that look like? Well, it's law-straight regulation that actually acts on Besson's recommendation, which is that we don't go and chastise Amazon for having a pretty successful cloud business. We try and encourage where there are other areas in the economy where firms, we encourage or incentivize those firms to open up some of that proprietary, complex tech that can be democratized and of a broader value across the economy.
I think it's having that abundance over scarcity mindset when regulating. Yeah.
Yeah, most certainly.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Nex Gen podcast by LIDC. To stay up to date with future episodes, we invite you to visit the LIDC website and subscribe to this channel. We look forward to having you with us again soon.